Thanks very much, Lyndall. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Just like to thank CEDA for the opportunity of coming back to State of the Nation. And as Lyndall said, it's rather a good opportunity with my term as CEO of Infrastructure Australia coming to an end soon. So I just want to thank everyone for their resilience, by the way, and managing to stay to the end of the day. It's much appreciated. It's always great to come here, and I think as I am moving on at the end of July, it's a really good opportunity to reflect back on the last 3 and a bit years, which is really, it's really a circle that's closing today. This morning we released a progress report, which is about prioritising reform. And some of you may know that back in 2015, we undertook an audit of Australia's future infrastructure needs. And that's really been the evidence base that's guided all our work over the last 3 years, not only in terms of the investments we need, but also the reforms that we need for the future. Many of you will be familiar, however, with the investment needs and this priority list. This is the authoritative list of Australia's future infrastructure investment needs. It's really serving us well, and we're really pleased that this version here, released back in March, is the third iteration, and it's really stood the test of time over the last 3 years. But it's not just about the investments, it's also about the reforms, and it's really that I'm going to focus on mostly today. You may remember that back in 2016 we launched the 15-year infrastructure plan, and that had 78 comprehensive recommendations in it. Everything around infrastructure gaps, everything around planning, but very much focused on meeting future population growth. It provides a reform and investment roadmap for Australia's governments to ensure our infrastructure drives productivity, that we improve our standard of living and deliver world-class services in our cities and our regions. The plan proposes some ambitious and politically challenging reforms. Some of them are regulatory reforms, some governance reforms, market reform, but these reforms need buy-in from both state and federal governments. Most of the recommendations are challenging, but we are pleased to see that the plan prompted a debate and a discussion around how willing we are to undertake some of these reforms. But at the time, we did note that these plans are only as good as the actions and the commitments that follow. To keep the momentum behind this reform paper we put out 2 years ago, we decided to commission this report that we're releasing today. We also commissioned a number of reform documents around things such as urban water reform, future cities planning, corridor preservation, value capture, public transport franchising, and most recently, a few weeks ago, we put out a paper around reform incentives. So, some guidance to governments, or particularly the federal government, around how it can incentivise reform with the states. All of these reports clearly identify the scale of the reform. They also outline the benefit to the taxpayer, often in dollars, but also outline the benefits that those who use infrastructure. So yes, it's big stuff that politicians like cutting ribbons on, but ultimately the infrastructure is supporting the services that people use. So we're very much focused from a user perspective in all our work. We feel we've done a lot over the last 2 years to advance these reforms, but it's really important that we do take stock today and step back and have a look at where the progress is. Now, what I'd like to do is give you a bit of a flavour for some of the things that we've noted. I'm not going to do a tick box against all 78 recommendations. I think the overall summary is there's some good progress, some really good progress, and there's some areas that we could do better. But we do acknowledge that reform is hard, and having said that, some of the things that have advanced, I think, should be noted. Heavy vehicle road user charging is progressing. A renewed national freight and supply chain strategy is under development, and I know that got some mention this morning by the Minister or the Deputy Prime Minister. But also we're seeing targeted funding at pinch points and first and last miles The first and last mile issues have been funded as well. Some long-term corridor preservation's been done. That's good to see. And we've seen the government open to using government debt to fund projects, the whole good debt, bad debt discussion. At the city level, we've seen some good integrated planning, transport and land use planning. And we've certainly seen a greater focus on major growth areas, such as Western Sydney. And that's a case in point where we're seeing stronger collaboration. And that's really, I think my observation after 3 years in this role is, through the efforts of many organisations, we're seeing a far greater level of collaboration, even with local government, which often wasn't the case, and certainly wasn't the case back in 2008 when Infrastructure Australia was established. In fact, back then we were the only infrastructure body around the country, and now I'm very pleased to say there's a number of infrastructure bodies being established, in fact, in most state and territories, with two being set up right now. So, we're seeing really the rollout of the model in terms of an independent body able to provide independent advice to governments. That works very well for us at Infrastructure Australia as well. It gives us some friends to talk to around the country, and with a like-minded focus on the long-term planning, on developing good project solutions, and also driving some of the reforms. So that model works really well, and we do meet regularly as a group, which provides a really effective environment. So pleased to see all of that, and there's no question, we're often, I'm really a glass half full today. There's no question that, we've got a complex governance framework in place with 3 tiers of government here for everything we do. But actually, when you go around the world, which some of our colleagues do, and we talk to people, we're one of the few countries that actually has this kind of priority list. So we should be proud of that. What we need to do is make sure that we use it, and I'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of reform, there are some areas that have stalled. And we should remember we've done this before. Back in the 80s and 90s, we had a period of strong reform. In fact, one could argue that reform has led to the 26 years of economic growth that we've heard about today. But I think one of the things I hear a bit around the traps is, there's a danger we become complacent. And I think there certainly is a danger that we are complacent. So it's really important, I think, that we all play our part, and particularly business. So the business community played a strong role in the reforms back in the 90s, and I think we need to see business making a greater contribution now. We also need to see a strong spirit of bipartisanship, and I think from an independent body's point of view, we certainly have benefited from that and appreciated that bipartisan, in fact, multi-party support that we get. But I think we need that on a broader basis, and we really need to have a focus on the long-term future of the country. So in terms of the long-term and the planning, one of the findings one of the things we observed through our audit and commented on in our plan was the need to have a national population policy. I think probably policy was the wrong word. It might have been better if we'd have called it a plan. So I'd rather call it a national population plan or a settlement plan. And this has certainly been something I've heard a lot going around the country, that many of our state and territory colleagues are responding to growth. And I think there's a strong message coming back that they'd like to see a more joined up approach with the federal government, coming together with all state and territory governments and actually looking to the long term, making sure we're making smart decisions, making sure we're taking the opportunity to develop some of our smaller cities like Adelaide and so on, that it's not just about the 4 major capital cities in terms of growth. But one of the things this plan needs to bring is really is a spatial plan for the long term, because it's that's really the basis for state and territory governments to do their land use planning. And that's why I think we've struggled with land use planning, because it's been quite responsive to growth. And what we need to do is get on the front foot and actually put down long-term land use plans, and then we can back them in with transport plans and infrastructure plans more broadly. Particularly important when we've got the levels of growth that we're seeing at the moment in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Perth. And in terms of how those plans are being developed, I'm really pleased to report back on the progress that we've seen in the last couple of years in terms of the greater integration of the plans in those 4 places. There's a much greater level of coordination going on, and I think that's really should be applauded. And that's important in terms of project development and project selection. And I think that's an area that I would like to provide a bit more commentary on. So over the last 10 years, we've certainly seen a credible pipeline of projects being developed, and that's represented, or is initiated and supported by this priority list. And this list that we put back out in March was, it had about $55 billion worth of projects on the list. And at the same time, when we updated it, we took off about $25 billion worth of projects, which are actually moving into construction. So, I think that illustrates that this kind of pipeline is starting to work. One of the other great things is actually, from our point of view, is seeing these jobs actually getting constructed and seeing the benefits that those projects are going to deliver for people around the country. So we've had some very significant projects move off the list. Recently, we've had the Western Sydney Airport, Inland Rail, WestConnect, Sydney Metro, Melbourne Metro Tunnel, Moorebank Intermodal Terminal, the M80 Ring Road upgrade, CityLink Tullamarine widening, Brisbane Metro, Bruce Highway upgrades, Forestfield Airport Link and Adelaide's North-South Corridor, and I think probably the only places I missed are ACTNT and Hobart, But one of the challenges, I think, with the list and with governments, as mentioned in the introduction, is that governments like making announcements. And one of the observations from my time in this role over the last 3 years is it's really difficult to engage communities and make sure we get the right project delivered if we make early announcements. And it's really critical that governments, as this federal government has been doing, commit to funding business cases, but hold their powder dry in terms of the full funding of projects until we actually know if that's the right solution to the problem. It's really difficult to backtrack from committing to a project solution once you've committed the full funding to it. So we'd like to see a greater discipline from all levels of government in committing to projects before we know what the right solution is. Why? Well, because that means we're spending more money on a solution where we could have spent some of that on another priority. So it's pretty straightforward. We also think that what the federal government's done in terms of funding business cases, $250 million in the recent federal budget, and that's really great, and it's a really good way of instilling discipline. But what we'd like to see is that funding being conditional on good practice, on looking at all the options and developing the right solution. We think that'll go a long way to getting best value out of our investments. One of the most critical reforms, though, that we identified in our plan, and probably the most challenging one, is the one around how we pay for our roads. And this was certainly the biggest recommendation in our 15-year plan. We were very pleased when the government responded to that plan back in November 2016 that they committed to a public inquiry into road reform. The government's still to commence that inquiry, but we think it's really critical that we get on with that, as the challenge of funding isn't getting any easier, and we're seeing a consistent fall in excise with the uptake of electric vehicles, but also with the more efficient fossil fuel vehicles. And we need to get on the front foot in terms of planning for the long term. How do we maintain our roads? How do we pay to maintain our roads? How do we pay for new infrastructure when the pot of money's declining? Road market reform has the potential to deliver significant improvements in our network performance, but also address fairness issues. And I think this is an area that people have a great concern in terms of bringing something new in. Is it going to be equitable? Our argument right now is what we've got isn't equitable, that somebody living in regional Australia and driving a large engine vehicle is paying significantly more than somebody who's living in in an outer metropolitan area who's driving a smaller engine vehicle. And actually, the real issue now is somebody driving a hybrid vehicle is paying very, very little through fuel excise, and electric vehicle drivers are paying nothing. So, you know, that's inequitable. What we need to do is address that issue in the longer term, but also, you know, address this funding issue that isn't going to get any easier. So that remains one of the major recommendations that we're recommending moves forward through an inquiry. That was a really high-speed whiz through some of the highlights of the progress report. I commend it to you. It's available on our website, as are all our reports, and as is this priority list. And by the way, this is out of date because we published it in March, and this is a live document. So every day we receive business cases from our colleagues around the country, and indeed last week our board reviewed 2 of those business cases, so they'll be going up on the website shortly. If you haven't seen the evaluations that we do, I'd commend you to those as well. It's quite an educational process in terms of how some of these projects get put together. So I've covered a lot of ground. In conclusion, we've never lacked vision in this country. We've got a long and proud history of reform. We'd really like to draw inspiration from that and see a new period of reform. We think we put a pretty comprehensive reform agenda together here in the form of our plan. We'd like to see everyone getting behind that, and as I said, it's not just a job for governments, it's a job for business as well. What we're doing next is we're commissioning, or we're just undertaking our next audit, which we'll be publishing next year, and that will be followed 2 years later with the next infrastructure plan. So this is a continuum, recognising that some of these reforms do take more than the 2 years since we put the last plan together. We're going to keep the agenda moving forward, and I'd like to just acknowledge those that have made a contribution over the last couple of years to this work in terms of the Infrastructure Australia Board, and wish them and the Chair well in the next period of the organisation's development. It's certainly been my great privilege and honour to play a small role in leading the organisation over the last 3 years, and I really look forward to seeing the great success going forward. Thanks very much for remaining here this afternoon and listening to what I had to say. Thank you.